I am so excited to welcome Nicole on with us right now. Nicole, how are you today?
I am great. Thank you very much for having me.
I'm so excited because you are a neuroscientist, you have a master's in organizational psychology, and you're a personal coach, which is so many titles and just totally awesome. Can I
Oh,
say
bless
that?
you. Yeah, thank you. That's
Yeah,
really kind.
I mean, incredible. Like, I think you're
Thank you
someone
so
that
much.
so many people can look up to, and just having that titles many titles doesn't necessarily mean the world, but to me, I'm like, this person is
Oh,
a total badass.
thank you so much. I recently wrote about my journey to neuroscience as well because I started studying when I was a bit older than everybody else. I was 27. So I was starting my BSc. So I always felt a little bit out of place. I almost felt a bit sort of dumb, if you will, because all these students knew how to study and I hadn't studied for 8 years. So it was really hard for me to sort of get into it. And I remember spending all of first year just trying to learn how to study again.
Well,
So
I think that's even cooler that you were able to decide what some would consider older part of your life and be like, "I wanna try
actual
this." Some
student.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, what
Oh,
some people may see as difficult and hard for you, I think it's pretty awesome that you did that. So
thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited for this.
yeah, me too. So with all of those titles, you have some incredible knowledge, and I want to start with something super easy just to kick it off, and we're going to talk
Yeah.
about the basics of brain health. So, how would you know if your brain is healthy and happy versus kind of living in a state of turmoil or chaos per se?
Well, that's hard to answer because it depends on whether you have stuff going on. But I always say that a lot of individuals will work on their mental health, but then they won't be working on their brain health. So it's quite hard to sort of be cognitively um, there, if you will, or happy if you're not getting the sleep in, if you're not hydrating correctly, if you're not exercising. So put provided you've got all of those things ticked off and your mental health is still not great, then you can start thinking, okay, maybe there's something in your life that's troubling you or you've got a lot of stress. But ticking off the basics means that then your brain can do what it needs to, and those are things like sleep, those are things like nutrition, hydration, and exercise. And we don't have to go crazy with all these things either. I post about exercise and I think some people get a bit triggered thinking, like you have to be a marathon runner. You don't have to, you can go for a walk. Something as profound as just going for a walk can be so beneficial for your brain.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you about that because we know exercise is good for many things, right?
Yeah.
Not just brain health, but just
Yeah.
health in general. And like you
Yeah.
mentioned, it doesn't have to be anything crazy. What are
Yeah.
some, other activities that we can do on top of exercising that are good for your brain health? And, maybe share why exercise is so important as we can reiterate that message too.
Yeah. So, I mean, exercise is great because I always try and post about reasons to exercise that are not associated to weight loss. I think when people hear the word exercise, they automatically think lose weight, but there's so much more to that. So, exercise increases something called BDNF, which is brain derived neurotrophic factor. It is essentially a protein or a molecule that helps strengthen the synapses in your brain. So, they actually looked at post-mortem brains of older individuals, and the ones that stayed active actually had more proteins in the synapses, meaning that their cognition was more integral. Their synapses were stronger. Okay. Now it's hard to imagine having synapses that are strong because we can't see them. But if you think about a muscle being strong, you think about your bones being strong, having more bone density, it's the same thing as happening in your brain with brain derived neurotrophic factor. It's actually literally solidifying these synapses so that we can maintain cognition. Another thing about exercise is that resistance exercise especially increases something called IGF-1, insulin growth like factor 1, and that is extremely beneficial in maintaining cognition as well. So I always encourage everyone to exercise for those reasons because longevity is anchored in what we do right now with our lives, with our habits and our health and just small things. Again, it doesn't need to be crazy stuff. So there was another question you had.
Yes. Well, so, as if mental health, physical health aren't enough, do it for your brain health too, right?
Yeah, yeah. And it all goes hand in hand. I mean, it's all tied together. You know, when you exercise, you release endorphins, you feel good. No one regrets an exercise. I appreciate that some people, find it a bit daunting, a bit stressful. I get a lot of people that say that it actually causes them anxiety. And I can completely sort of resonate with that because I think we are in a culture that sort of encourages exercise from a weight loss perspective, and we have so many social media influencers that look great, and people probably feel intimidated. I understand, but there's so many hobbies, there's so many things you can do that don't need to be like going to the gym and lifting. It could be walking or yoga or even meditating is so good for BDNF. Taking up a sport, swimming. You don't even have to talk to anyone when you're swimming, so your ears are literally underwater.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I love those. Those are some, other activities you can do. That was one of the things that I asked about. Is there anything outside of exercise that you're like, make sure you're doing this for your brain health? Exercise is really important. What's kind of some other ones there?
Yeah, I think the key to keeping brain health is staying active. So, not just physically, but mentally as well. So, continue to learn new things, continue to stay engaged with life. I know that jobs can get very stressful. And I think we all saw it through the lockdown, when we're in these confined spaces and people having to live in maybe not such happy homes, or maybe just seeing the same thing every day. It's taxing on the brain. And we do see it in research, and especially in mice experiments, when you put them in an environment that is monotonous and that is not joyful, they will dispense drugs if they are available. But the drug is available even if they are in an environment that is happy, and they choose not to dispense drugs. So the choice is always there. They just the environment is what keeps them happy. So staying engaged with life, so finding a hobby. And we see this in older individuals who maintain volunteering jobs or hobbies or continue to socialize with friends. They live more prosperous lives, and that is linked to BDNF. When we are learning, when we continue to learn, we continue to change our brain to sort of, it's almost like not letting it stagnate, if you will. And that is because of BDNF. When we learn, we increase BDNF as well. So I actually get all my clients to do some ball training games, or I encourage them to use the opposite hand. So try and brush your teeth with your left hand if you're right-handed, or the other hand if you're left-handed. It's really hard and it's actually really challenging. So just taking your mind and your brain sort of to places where it's not comfortable will mean that it has to drive BDNF, and then in turn keep integrity.
Well, I mean, I took up adult gymnastics at 28 and I felt really good about that. But now I want to brush my teeth with my left hand because that sounds
Yeah.
even more challenging.
Yeah. And I mean, I think it's just something like the lowest hanging fruit that I always give out on podcasts or people that ask me questions. What's the best way to keep my brain health at the cheapest cost is just hydrating consistently, literally hydrating water. Because I found it's quite crazy, but there's a lot of people that don't drink a lot of water throughout the day. I have clients that only drink coffee and then tea in the evening. It's very British. And I was saying, no, you've got to drink water. There's water in my coffee. And I'm thinking, no, you have to drink water.
Well, I will say I am one of those people. For whatever reason, my taste buds hate water. I don't know where that came out.
Yeah.
And I do my best though to still force myself to drink water because I do know I feel better when I have
Yeah.
it.
Could you put electrolytes in it? That's an
Oh,
even better
yes.
thing. If you can afford electrolytes, pop them in, and then you've got a flavored water. So,
Yes, I do Mio. Mio is my like go-to to
right.
use and just squirt it in and it makes me drink more water. So I, found the little cure all.
Perfect. Perfect. And if it's got electrolytes in it, it's even better because your synapses communicate through a sodium potassium pump, which is literally sodium potassium communicating through a membrane. And that's how we generate energy to spike an action potential, which then sends the information to another synapse. You see? So something as simple
Wow.
as ingesting electrolytes can help maintain cognition and brain health.
I love when, we find out that we're doing good things, right? It's normally we
Yeah.
find out we're doing bad things. I'm really excited when I find out I did
Yeah.
something good. Um,
Yeah.
I also want to talk to you about, is it actually true that different parts of our brain trigger different things? They talk about the right brain and the left brain and creativity versus analytical. Is that something that's actually true, or is that something that just kind of came out into the universe?
Well, it came out into the universe with good reason, but we did dispute, we did sort of disprove it, if you will. So the left side of the brain and the right side of the brain both work together in language. So they used to think that the left side was more logical. I think it's that way around. I don't even know anymore because I know that it's not that way. So I think the left side they believe was more logical because it dealt with language, but actually the right hand side helps sort of put the sentence together. So it puts sort of context to the message, whereas the left side just sort of picks up on the actual words. But no, we don't have a sort of left brain, right brain dominancy. But with that being said, the left side of the brain does control the right, and the right does control the left. So if you're right-handed and you use your right hand more, you might be using it a bit more of your left hand side, but the brain is always going to maximize itself, and it's always going to make sure that it's using 100% of its energy. And the other myth is that we use 10% of our brains. And that's not true. We use 100%. So the brain will maximize itself where it can. So creativity and logical thinking actually come from two separate networks. One network for creativity is called the default mode network. It's a network of three brain areas that actually form a triangle, sort of like here in the frontal lobes, and then down to the sides, and then sort of back together. Okay, so you can see it's now on both sides, and that's responsible for mind wandering, sometimes rumination as well, but that creativity. And individuals who have a higher connectivity in that system are able to siphon memories and use them as inspiration, which someone like me will probably lack a little bit of, although I'm a little bit creative, but it can be trained. The brain is plastic, so it can be trained. You can become more creative, you can become more logic. The logic side, well, the logic network of the brain is also on both sides, and it's called a central executive network. So that's cognitively demanding tasks, problem solving, and there will be higher connectivity in the frontal lobes because that's where your conscious sort of decision making comes from.
Wow, that is fascinating, especially like to learn the myths that we learn thanks to the internet. You know, the internet's good and bad, right? But thank you for debunking some of those for us.
I think the left brain, right brain was sort of proven. Yeah, like I said, they did have sort of reason to believe that. Whereas the 10% thing, I think probably what happened is maybe someone was trying to really help people unlock their full potential and sort of use that as a motivational speech.
Yes. Well, it sounds like we can use all of our brains to unlock some new potential because it's constantly
Yes.
learning.
Yeah, exactly.
And you often talk about rewiring the subconscious part of our brains. You
Yeah.
know, why would someone need to do this or want to do this? What does that kind of look like?
So I get a lot of clients that sort of come to me and they say, I have these thoughts, I have these negative thoughts, and they're purely based on, or they have negative ideas about themselves. And they're normally based on either what their parents said, or what friends around them said while they were growing up. So observational knowledge is fantastic because we can learn how to get to school with our parents without paying attention, right? But we also see how they interact in the world and we learn from them. So a lot of my clients will have picked up habits from their parents that they wish they didn't have. And I think a lot of people can resonate with that. And a lot of people are trying to sort of break those patterns as well. Whether that's true or not, there are other ways that that can manifest itself. So maybe you have bad experiences, maybe you have trauma. I don't want to get too much into the topic of trauma because that's another topic in on itself. But you have these deeply ingrained memories that are integrated into your behavior. Okay, and they're in your subconscious, if you will. So 90% of our brains, around 90%, is subconscious. 10% is your conscious thought. Now, what I mean by that is when you pick up your toothbrush, you start brushing your teeth with your right hand side, right? You don't even think about that. You just do it. It's automatic. When you sort of scope out the world, your brain is constantly matching images with what it already knows and telling your basal ganglia, which is the part in the brainstem, that everything is fine. If something is out of place, if something is new, or there's a car driving down a one way or on a pavement, that's when the image doesn't make sense to your brain, and that's when it alerts your conscious brain to do something about it. And that same thing happens with behaviors. So little patterns, little messages that we tell ourselves, little negative thoughts, automatic reactions when especially my women clients will look in the mirror and automatically think that they don't look good. So those are the subconscious thoughts and patterns that we want to break. We want to change them because they are not true. And if they are true, we can work on them.
I love that. So that's something you work with clients to help them kind of, for lack of a better way to say it, rewire their brain.
Yeah, what I do, we also look at brain performance. So depending on who the client is and depending on what they want to do, but nine, I would say maybe 8.5 times out of 10, people have something that they want to change when it comes to thought processing.
Wonderful. That's really cool to hear that that's something we have access to do.
Yeah, the brain is plastic and the brain can change. The brain can change in pretty much almost any way. Of course, depending on how much attention and intention we put in, and depending, there are some genetic factors, of course, as well that might inhibit us, but we can always sort of get better and work with what we've got as well.
Yeah, and I do want to ask, there are people, mental health is a hot topic right now, right? Just talking about, which is awesome that people want to share more about it. But there is a difference from my understanding between, basically adaptational mental health and people who have mental health diseases. Is that
Yeah.
correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
So
And can you explain that a little? Because I know on the internet they kind of all get looped together and we think because we have one, we may have a disease, but that's not necessarily the case.
not necessarily the case, and I encourage anyone who might sort of pick up on what I'm about to say to pay attention. And I think the most important thing in these things is to not self-diagnose. If you think that you have a mental health disorder or disease, to go and see a professional. Now, disease or disorder is on a spectrum, right? You can go through a period of depression that that is real, that is true, that is, but not necessarily have the clinical sort of etiology for disorder, for that disorder. It might be temporary, it might be circumstantial, it might be due to a chronic inflammation in the system. So you're going through a very stressful period. You are susceptible to chronic inflammation, and chronic inflammation is one of the biggest contributors, sorry, to depressive symptoms. But that can change. Now, it's hard for me to obviously give out universal
Yes.
advice on a podcast because I don't know who the listeners are. But of course, there are spectrums to it, and I think we are uncovering a lot about depression and other brain health disorders that I'm hopeful for the future in mental health.
That's a really exciting thing to hear too, because the fact that we just keep advancing in technology and knowledge puts us on a better track, right?
Yeah, and the fact that we're talking about it, that's cathartic in itself. I mean, I went on a live with someone, Dr. Caroline Boyd, and she was talking about how actually we have this ability to self-heal, and she was talking about it from a traumatic side because she deals with trauma. And she was saying, and I love that because she was saying that talking to friends, talking to family, talking to loved ones is already going to start the process of you healing, and it is within yourself, right? There's a doctor in America, Bruce D. Perry. He's amazing. I love him. He's a child psychiatrist, and he always says that, I've read a couple of his books, that the children that he deals with, the ones that are placed in loving homes or have a good network around them of supportive friends, family, relatives, maybe even parents, they are the ones that will thrive and get through it. Okay, so human connection and just being able to confide in someone can already be so healing for the individual.
Yes, and that's, why I started this podcast was to ensure that we feel more connected to people and less alone in
Mm,
what's happening in our lives. So
yeah.
I'm glad to hear that even if, maybe somebody didn't get that as a child, maybe they're getting it now, even a little bit
Yeah.
through this podcast.
100%, and it can change. And also, I did a little bit of a deep delve, and there's not that much research around this, but I actually started sort of doing a bit of sort of research in asking people, and having a pen pal, an online friend, can be just as therapeutic as having an in-person friend. Obviously there are benefits to having someone there, and the touch, the sensation is nice, but having a pen pal or someone online can be just as useful. So I know that there's a lot of people that struggle with loneliness, but the good news is that we can reach out to the internet for help.
Yes, the good side of the internet.
Yeah, yeah. And I see a lot of the bad side, but I always feel like I see the best of the internet because I have an educational channel, because I get to interact with people like you, because I get to interact with so many amazing people that I don't find that social media is, that draining. But that's obviously I've cut out the toxic, as much as I can. So
Yes, and it definitely exists, but I think it's all about perspective too. I think that helps.
100%. And being able to sort of set your boundaries and protect yourself as well. Like if you know that something's triggering you, unfollow that person. Don't, if you see, if you, don't feel good about yourself and you have body confidence issues, then don't follow models because, that's their side of the story, but we don't know the other side. So, and you're comparing this one little corner of your life with their corner of their life.
Yes, and that's funny, you bring up something that I hadn't originally wanted to ask you about, but the whole idea that your mind plays tricks on you, is that an actual true saying, or is that also something we made up?
No, so we have a negativity bias. We are more susceptible to thinking negative. So they did this in studies of economics, and it's called loss aversion. So if you receive three nice comments on your Instagram, but you receive one nasty one, you will most likely go to bed worrying about the nasty one instead of remembering the three nice ones, right? That's negativity bias. So the ratio is about 2.5, 3 to 1. So then we have this limbic system, which is your emotional brain. And then we have sort of logic brain, which is your central executive or executive function, which is sort of putting you in logical thinking. So, when you're hungry and you're literally hangry, it's a
Yes.
thing. It's your emotional brain talking, and then you eat and you're like, oh, I'm so sorry. I don't know why I said that. And so
I know that
it's
all too well, way too well.
same, same. I actually miss time my lunches quite often sometimes because I'm so busy. Like my schedule's never quite the same, and my boyfriend's always like shaking, like sort of shaking his head at me, like you've got to stop getting hangry.
It also tends to lean more on the women. I've noticed women get hangry more often than men. I
Yeah.
wonder why that happened, but
I have no idea, but I'm going to go and research that now. So, yes, our anxious brain or our emotional brain will make us believe things that are not necessarily true. Okay. And there might be some element to that. So, what I always say to my clients is write it down. Write it down, make a list, because that's going to activate your logical thinking. Now you start writing it down. Now you can start seeing it on paper from a different perspective, from a logical perspective. Then you can start assessing, is this actually real? These things that I'm saying to myself, are they true? Okay, fine, maybe they are, but we can change them, right? If we can't, then we need to find a way to work through them. But most of the time, people sort of they over sort of judge how they actually feel about themselves until they actually start talking to me and they're like, oh, actually, yeah, maybe it wasn't that bad.
yes.
And I think that it is definitely a thing, and that's not to sort of discount anyone's anxiety or to say that it's not real, but that is to say that we do have this emotional brain that talks to us quite often.
Gosh, that dang emotional brain, I think it gets us more than we think.
Especially if you are sort of in survival mode, if you are highly strung, highly stressed, your brain is going to be operating to just keep you alive. And that is an emotional thing, right? So you're going to be triggered much easier. You're going to be emotional much easier. So there's a we can see why people suffer so much with these thoughts, these intrusive thoughts, and depressive symptoms as well. And it's a real hole to get out of sometimes. It's and anyone that can and has, they should really thank themselves because it's so hard to get yourself out of that dip back out and like, okay, I'm actually okay now.
Yeah, and I think we need to take that too. Anyone who just heard her say that, if you've come out of that, definitely celebrate yourself because that's a
100%.
accomplishment in itself.
Yeah, exactly. And on a neurobiological level, it is a whole, your all your monoamines, your dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, they're all low. We don't know exactly. And I think a lot of people probably read the paper about the serotonin theories, but there is a monoamine theory around depression. And we know that, when our motivation's low, dopamine's low, norepinephrine is low. So to boost those things, we normally have to do things to get us out of those holes. But that's the catch 22, isn't it? Because the thing that's going to make you feel good is getting out of it, is going for a run, is speaking to someone. But those things in itself can be so challenging because sometimes just reaching out to someone can feel so hard. And the last thing you want to do is go for a run when you're not feeling great, even though it is the thing that makes you feel better.
Yes, and I think it's super important to do that even when it's almost more important to do that when you don't feel like doing it.
Yeah, yeah.
You also posted something on Instagram that was really interesting to me. And shout out your Instagram real quick while we're thinking about
It's
it.
Thank you. It's Nicole's Neuroscience. So pretty simple. Nicole's Neuroscience. And yeah,
So much great content there. You had
thank
posted something
you.
about how every decade we lose like 5 to 10% of these neurons
Yeah.
and you it makes it harder for us to be motivated to do things. Can you
Yeah.
talk about that a little bit?
Yes, so we lose dopamine, not necessarily neurons. So I don't want to scare everyone into thinking that they're losing brain mass, although that is a thing, but we'll talk about that another time. So dopamine, we lose about 5 to 10%. Now, the caveat is that we do need to keep moving to keep that dopamine up. So that's why, you hear about older people that want to exercise and they can't do it. It's because they don't have that motivation. They also take less risks. That's one of the reasons why we motivate. Dopamine is your motivation neurotransmitter, not necessarily the reward neurotransmitter. So making sure that you stay active and keeping those dopamine levels up is extremely important in making sure that we're buffering the amount that we're losing, because we will lose dopamine levels. Of course, that is just the nature of the aging brain, but it's how much we can soften the blow, if you will. I
Yes.
actually had a client who said that to me once. He was like, I just want to soften the blow of aging. And I thought that's a brilliant way to put it.
Yes, and also very fair because
Yeah.
the older I get, the more I realize getting old is very scary and not something we talk about very often.
Yeah. Well, they celebrate it in Japan and, other countries like, and they celebrate their women that are wise because they've gone through it. They know it. They go to them and there's a reason why they respect them. I think we need to adopt that sort of behavior a little bit more in Western worlds. I think anyway, a little bit.
Yes, I'm totally with you. You
Yeah.
also mentioned how the cells in our body are constantly regenerating based on the things we put into our body.
Yeah.
And I think that's interesting because, especially over here in the United States, there's a lot of discussion about the food, about things that are going on
Mm.
inside those foods that we're putting inside our bodies. So, in a perfect world, what are some things that we would need to keep away from like putting inside our bodies so we don't, deal with this as bad?
Yeah. I mean, I always say if it has packaging and an advertisement, and if it has packaging and you can't get it in its truest form, I would probably try and limit it. Okay. Anything with an advertisement is probably a no-no. If it has an advertisement, it's in a bag of peas, that's different because you can get that in its truest form. I get asked about oats. Of course, you can get oats in their truest form, but normally if you can't find the product, you know, in its truest form, then stay away. Ultra processed foods, ultra processed sugar, fizzy drinks, not water, but sodas and stuff like that. I mean, they have so many added. I mean, I went and buy barbecue sauce the other day because we wanted to make pulled pork, and ironically, I saw the one on the shelf that was going to look the healthiest. And when I got home, my boyfriend was like, oh my gosh, he was like reading out all these things and all these numbers. And we were like, no way, we just put it straight in the bin because it's not worth it. But so if the label has loads of ingredients in it, I would question that.
Okay, that's good
Yeah.
to know. And something I've been trying to adapt in my diet, but I also, I know how hard that is when we get used to a certain lifestyle.
100%. And the thing is, there's research to show that individuals that eat ultra processed diets actually consume 500 calories more per day than individuals who don't, even though both groups report the same levels of satiety and the same level of enjoyment in their food. Okay. So that is just the neurons in your stomach that have adapted to pick up these particular foods. That is your brain telling you that you're craving these foods. But over time, it will stop doing that. And when you start eating better, you start eating healthy, you'd actually stop craving those kinds of foods. And those foods are designed to do that to you. Okay. So I don't want anyone that's listening to this to feel bad about themselves because they eat ultra processed foods. That is literally the marketing scheme that they implemented on us. They knew exactly what they were doing. Okay. So it's about stepping away from that and knowing that those foods are there to trick you into eating them. And there's nothing wrong with you. That is just how they are designed.
Please remember that, everyone. I'm going to remember that. I need to take that
Yeah.
with me every day. There's one other thing I want to talk to you about. I also saw on your Instagram page, again, just incredible content. You had a breakup protocol by a neuroscientist.
Yeah.
And I would love for you to kind of explain that situation that you had posted about because, we often hear about people getting out of relationships and breakups are really hard.
Breakups are really hard. Breakups are so hard, and they send you into a spiral. I mean, you can get depressive symptoms, feelings of suicide, and that is because you have been used to having this person in your life all the time. Okay, so your brain has rewired itself to be able to reach out for this person anytime it wanted to speak to that person. So, on a biological level, your brain has rewired itself to know that that person is there. When that person gets cut off, it's extremely difficult for the brain to comprehend that. It will diminish serotonin. There's other, dopamine factors as well. So all of that can be very confusing, can be very, very painful. So again, the good news is that the brain can change. And actually, we adapt from our experiences. So, usually, what happens is the second time around, we become wiser. We either don't open up as easy or we know how to deal with it better because we've been through it before, right? So, I think for myself, especially, my second breakup wasn't nearly as difficult as maybe my first one. My third one was because that one was a very traumatic one. But anyway,
That's a
so
different situation.
that's yeah, exactly. So, and that's the other thing you have to assess, how traumatic was a relationship because trauma bonding in itself is so deeply ingrained. What happens is you have these periods of, where someone makes you feel rubbish and then that sort of dips you a little bit. And then the reward feels so much bigger because now they're nice to you. They promise they're never going to do it again. And that reward actually strengthens the synapses even more because there's more going on in the brain instead of a sort of steady state relationship. Does that make sense?
Yes,
And
it does.
and I think a lot of people can resonate with that because yeah, it is a real thing and it's really hard to get out of. So rewiring your brain, so imagining your life without that person, sort of waking up and just saying to your brain, hey, like this person is not here anymore and it sucks, but it's okay because we're going to be okay. We're going to learn from this and it's going to be all gravy. So that's where visualization comes in, and it is extremely important because it does actually work. It does help in teaching us that that person's not there anymore. Engaging in activities that are going to make us happy, so help us rewire our brains. Most people will take up a hobby like gymnastics. I took up ballet or yoga, or they'll do something crazy with their hair. That's because they are longing for change. And I said to you earlier, when we are changing, we're increasing BDNF. If we can increase BDNF, we are priming our brain for change, which means that we can get over the breakup quicker. Okay, because our brain is now primed for rewiring.
I love that. And I've suggested, I never knew why I suggested it to people. I have been through enough breakups in my life that one of the things I realized is learning something new at least distracted me from what was
Yeah.
going on. I never realized that it was actually my brain was wanting me to do that.
Yeah, it's sort of saying like we want BDNF, we want to rewire. I mean, I don't know if it's saying that. That's not very scientific of me to say that, but
No,
I'm
I think
putting
it
a
totally is.
I'm putting a narration on my brain.
I love that. Well, thank you so much again for joining me today, talking with
Yeah,
me about all things brain health and
yeah.
just the brain in general. It's one of those things that I would love to learn so much more about. I don't think you can ever get enough knowledge about the brain.
Oh, bless you. We'll have to do another one. But thank you so much for having me, Morgan. This has been brilliant.